All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk About It. I'm Megan.
And I'm Jackie.
And today we are actually interviewing my dad, Derek Perdue. So obviously I know you. Jackie just met you, but can you just tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, all that stuff?
Okay. Well, yes, I am Megan's father, so that's the most significant thing in my life right there. That and that I'm married to, Michelle, but
Yes.
and I have a few other kids too, so I should probably throw them in there.
No, I'm the only kid, the only one that matters.
So, I grew up in charismatic and Pentecostal circles. And kind of from there, I went off to Bible college where I did a Pastoral Studies degree. I've kind of done bivocational stuff, which means I've always had a job in the secular realm and done stuff and worked with stuff in the church. So I have a master's in computers, and I also have a master's in Christian thought from Bethel Seminary. So did the whole, technical computer thing, as well as theology and philosophy, which people find really funny that I do both of those, but that's me and my interests. And so kind of there, done a lot of different things with churches, from doing things to assist and doing, those type of things, to trying to do a church plant and go through that process. I got saved and came to know the Lord when I was 6 years old. And so it has been, a journey in the church all throughout my experience, from house churches to, mega churches, to little itty bitty country churches, to where we're at now, which is a church that I think we had 1,400 people on Sunday morning for Easter. So different dynamics that are there. So
Yeah, and we're super excited to talk with you today about navigating church hurt, which is something we've actually had a few audience members request. But real quick, because you mentioned, you were Pentecostal, you went to a Pentecostal Bible school. Obviously this could be a whole podcast episode, but just real briefly, kind of like, what's your journey been when in terms of denomination even?
Ooh, yeah, that gets interesting. So yeah, I grew up in charismatic circles, as in my parents got kicked out of the church in the 70s because during the charismatic renewal. And because they were part of a church that didn't believe any of that, so they got kicked out and did house churches for a while. So my young experience in the church was house churches in a very charismatic setting. From there, went into Assemblies of God. Grew up, my late grade school, junior high school in Assemblies of God circles. Went to an Assemblies of God school, got licensed as an Assemblies of God minister, and then realized that I couldn't sign the statement of faith anymore. And we just found that I had some differing views on theology. There were a few points that they had in their statement of faith that I just couldn't affirm. And so instead of trying to fight with that, I just kind of stepped back and said, I need to reassess kind of where this is at. And kind of did a journey that took me to Reformed circles, and spent a lot of time dealing with that. And I'm not sure what I would classify myself now. I'm kind of post-Reformed. I'm probably more Reformed than one camp would like, and not Reformed enough for the other camp anymore. And that's kind of probably where I sit, if that kind of makes it as clear as it can be there.
Yeah.
But obviously that journey, because you're changing a lot theologically, means that you're navigating a lot of different things in the church. Because it's a lot of times it's when you're confronted with different elements, different things that you deal with in life, whether it be hardships in your own life or problems in the church, that make you kind of wrestle with different things that Otherwise you wouldn't question. And so when you question those things and wrestle with those things, that's what causes those shifts. And, for me, some of that shifting has been, problems in the church. As I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, there's often more gore than glory when it comes to the church.
So, as Megan said, we're going to talk about church hurt in this episode. And some people might not know what that term means. So, if you could define it for us before we dive into your experiences with it specifically.
Okay. I would say church hurt kind of falls into a couple categories. And I would say that it can be individual. So it can be a problem that is caused by interaction with individuals that cause you harm or hurt. And so it could be done at an individual level. So you have this expectation of family and of caring, and hey, you run into somebody that's not the experience that you've had. It could be institutional, as in the way the structure of the community goes, you get overrun. And that can oftentimes be the fun one where nobody did anything necessarily wrong, but you were hurt, or they don't even realize that they've caused that pain. And that can be difficult. And it's just how the institution of the church happened to run. And sometimes it can be direct abuse, whether that be not addressing properly abuse that's in the home. And so you've been left to hang, or it can be direct spiritual abuse that within the church itself, where somebody is doing something that I would classify as being sinful and evil, and they cause pain and harm. And that's to me, that's your church hurt. I've walked through that. Now what is kind of the way I would look at that.
And I feel like it's sort of become the reason a lot of people have like deconstructed or even left the church is because they have these experiences that are hurtful and they haven't been able to find healing within a church. And so they look outside of the church or elsewhere and feel like they're finding healing there. So I think it's helpful to talk to you about your experience because you're still very much involved in the church, very much still a Christian, not someone who has like decided to, find Jesus somewhere else. So maybe could you just kind of like talk a little bit about what your experience has been and what you've learned or how that's affected you?
Yeah, when we started looking at these questions and you're kind of wrestling through with this whole thing, is like, okay, so how much do you share? And, how much do you work through? I've been in the church a long time. I grew up in the church. And because of that, I'd say outside of having, been harmed like with sexual abuse or physical abuse, I think I've walked through just about every other kind of function that there is. The first time I think that for me, that hardship really kind of came into play was actually a result of my father's sin, where he had an affair and left my mother, and the church struggling to do right by trying to do church discipline, but doing it in such a way that it caused harm to us as children in the home. And so we had to walk through being there and going to church while everybody else, this is the big topic everybody's talking about. And they forget that as a child, you're there and you hear, and that's your dad. And I think that was probably the first time I had that experience. And it's one that has kept my oldest sister, out of the church ever since. And it was that experience from our childhood that was that pivotal moment. It was walking through that. And, that's one of those where nobody was intending to cause harm, but yet harm was kind of dealt with. I've dealt with a pastor who created an environment where they preached grace, but did it in such a way that what they gave you was law and separation and a sense that you had to have, everything just right.
Mm.
And if you didn't, then, somehow grace kind of became this whip of the law to beat you up with. And in spite of the fact that there was a lot of truth that was there was just some unhealthiness that was there that you that had impact and was difficult. And the person was very, Machiavellian, very, very controlling, very much a person who had that dynamic and easily manipulated. So even if you would go to confront them, you would have all your stuff planned out as to what you would say. You'd walk in there, and when you walked out, you would go, now, wait a minute. That didn't go anything like I had planned, and we did nothing, and we didn't talk about it. And somehow I came out agreeing with them, and that was kind of the dynamic was there. All the while he was having an affair for 2 years with a lady in the church that he had been counseling. And when he started preaching that certain sins were true, things to be concerned about, and certain sins weren't true things to be concerned about.
Oh, no.
And when confronted with this, I actually got disciplined from the pulpit, which is a very pleasant experience. And you walk away from that
sort of
going,
a public
"What happened?"
shaming.
Yes. Yep. And that was probably, I would say, probably one of the worst experiences that I've gone through. But I mean, I've also walked through churches where, there was a shame culture that kind of grew and built into it. So, as you're going through the dynamic, you felt like if I had questions or doubts, or if I was struggling, I couldn't share it, because to share it meant judgment and condemnation that would be put upon you. So you kind of held it all in and kind of had to hide your hurts and your doubts. And then, there's, difficulties even just with, trying to do ministry, where because of health issues, I spent time in a wheelchair and being overlooked for positions because you had a physical malady, which had nothing to do with your ability to actually do things spiritually, but, was something that people looked at and would say, we don't want somebody in a wheelchair, and having to wrestle with and deal with those type of feelings and dynamics as you walk through things. And so, so as I said, more gore than glory as you kind of go through that whole process. And yet in the end, I love the church. And that's, I think, the place where we still got to get back to.
Yeah, it's kind of the full spectrum in a way. You mentioned earlier too that, within church hurt, there can be cases of spiritual abuse. Would you say that in every case of church hurt, there's an element of spiritual abuse? Is it in specific circumstances? For people who have no idea what spiritual abuse could you kind of like work that out for them?
Spiritual abuse is when I use biblical language and biblical things to control behavior. And I do that through, it can be very manipulative. It can be gaslighting. It can be all sorts of, dynamics that are there, but I'm using this guise of spiritual authority or biblical authority to make it so that you can't be hurt and you can't be mad at me. So language like saying, Jesus won't forgive you if you don't forgive me. Well, okay, you better wrestle with that one. Yes, the Bible says to forgive, and yes, we are called to forgive, but we should be very careful on not addressing the hurt and the pain and the damage that's there, because the Bible never discounts sin and the effect of sin. And so we need to deal with it as a whole, and you can't use that, biblical language to, suppress that and suppress that dynamic. And those, I think, is how spiritual abuse often kind of plays out. You get that where you use theological language in the Bible, and the fact that, authority of a position to just kind of suppress that, where you can't be hurt, or you're told to be quiet, or to stay silent, to ignore the hurt, ignore the pain, or to disregard sin that's there, because to call the sin is to then put in question your own salvation or standing before God. And that's spiritual abuse. And no, not all church hurt is that.
Yeah.
Because church hurt sometimes can be people doing things that are perfectly within their right to do, and it's not a sinful act to do, but they do it in such a way that they forget that you are a human being with feelings. And when they hurt you, they forget to acknowledge and deal with that, because they feel like, if I say, I'm sorry, you're hurt, that somehow they're saying, I should have done something different, or that I did something wrong. And sometimes you can do it. You can not be wrong and still not be right in your actions. And so you can cause pain without doing the heavy-handed spiritual abuse.
Sure.
Now, sometimes in reacting to the fact that I've done that, I will turn to spiritual things to make it so I don't have to feel guilty about the fact that you're hurt. And I can then step into that spiritual abuse by saying things like, God is sovereign, which is very true, but God is sovereign, so he must have wanted this situation to work this way. And, there's a reality that God is sovereign, and we can lean on his sovereignty and his control of things. But that doesn't discount sin. It doesn't discount wrong, and it doesn't discount pain. That's why we have Psalm 88, which starts with, dark and gloomy, gets worse, and ends dark and gloomy, and it never gets better. There is that element in life that we all have our Psalm 88 moments where it just kind of hurts, and we have to deal with that reality. And it's not wrong to be hurt.
And kind of like what you were mentioning earlier too, there's a spectrum of, you can experience hurt from fellow congregants. So it's almost like a peer-to-peer church hurt. Then there's the spiritual authority hurt, or an institutional hurt. And I think a lot of times that's maybe where the spiritual abuse comes into play, because there is like a power imbalance in a sense. Me as a congregant versus this person that is put in the place of the shepherd and has this authority to teach, to exercise discipline. I mean, I can't put a pastor under spiritual discipline, like it's just the dynamic is completely different. And I think that's something that pastors have to be kept accountable for. And that's why there should be systems in place that is holding them accountable. And like you were mentioning with the one church, if you have a pastor in place who is very good at manipulating and gaslighting and twisting things so that he is the only one in control, that's where those situations can breed.
Yep. Especially when you start watching things, because it'll always start where there's lots of connections, lots of things, and then more and more, not only is the pastor or leaders becoming more isolated from outside authority that could question things, but they bring out even the congregation as a whole and pull them out of other avenues. So then it almost becomes what are those little not aquariums, but the little
like a terrarium.
terrariums. It becomes its own little ecosystem that feeds itself.
Yeah.
And you can kind of watch that dynamic happen in an unhealthy situation. And turning that, out and changing that is often very hard. But if you're watching that happen, it's something. The earlier that it's addressed and confronted, the better, because it's the more likely you can get back to health. But sometimes those dynamics just go, and it's just for your own health, it's time to find a different place to be. And so that's the dynamic. But oftentimes it's hard to switch, because you'll get the whole if they go out from us, they were never among us.
Yeah.
And where all of a sudden you feel like you're gonna lose friends, you're gonna lose that community connection, and that's a hard thing to risk. And yet, for your own health, sometimes that is the risk that needs to be taken.
And I think that's an element that's important to point out too, because I think a lot of times people maybe who haven't experienced any pain within the church would look at like that situation and be like, why wouldn't you just leave? Like, just leave. And in a sense, it's sort of like telling a wife of an abusive husband, like, well, why didn't you just divorce him? It's like, well, it's not quite that simple. And even in the leaving, there is pain. Even if you are leaving an unhealthy situation and going somewhere healthier, like there was a reason you were involved in that community in the first place. And that's painful to leave behind.
And no matter how hurt you are, in fact, the more you're hurt and angry, then the more you actually loved that community at one point in time. Because if you didn't love them, then they really can't hurt you.
Yeah.
So it's in that seeking of love and care that we make ourselves vulnerable to be hurt. But yet we have to make ourselves vulnerable or we never get the love and care and community that we need as well. And so that's the tie that's there.
And as I think both of you mentioned, a lot of times also, especially if there's spiritual abuse involved, there's a fear of if you leave, you'll lose your salvation, or you were somehow never really a Christian, however you view it. So it can be very difficult to leave because that tie is, you're tied to God. And in a lot of ways in spiritual abuse, if you leave, they're like, well, you're going to lose God. You'll have no way to reach God, or you're never a Christian if you leave. So it can become really, really tricky.
Or even having, even if you do have security, having people that you used to love and care about consider you not a Christian and a horrible person. That's hard.
Yep. Yeah. And it doesn't last. The Bible always talks about the fact that, sin is always found out. It's the revelation will always come. And, the reality of what goes on, it all happens. It just might happen many years after you're out of the environment and you're healed and you're no longer even looking at it. And you happen to stumble across somebody and you go, oh, hey, that actually all came to a head finally and was addressed by the Holy Spirit. And, those dynamics are there. Or, hey, that church doesn't exist anymore. Wonder why. Could be that God finally, took care of it himself. And, these things do happen and that dynamic is there. It's just that when you're dealing with the abuse, dealing with the pain of being hurt is a careful thing to do because, it's the kind of the dynamic of both the call and the comfort of the gospel is that as being hurt, I know the comfort of the gospel is that Jesus cares, that Jesus is walking through my hurt with me, and he experienced church hurt. It wasn't in the same sense, but he experienced betrayal of one of the 12. And he experienced the pain of going through that and dealing with that betrayal and that loss. He went through the experience of having his brothers not being with him and fleeing and not, seeing him for what he is. And he went through that. So as we walk through it, the comfort of the gospel is that God is there. He understands intimately the pain we are walking through, and he's not leaving us alone. But the call of the gospel is that when we're walking through that pain, it's easy for those who are hurt and have been abused to become the abuser. It's easy for us to turn that hurt into an unhealthy anger that then is something that will actually can poison us. And we become that which we actually hate and desire not to be. And so the call of the gospel is that in spite of being hurt, I'm not free to sin. Because God has not called me to sin. He's called me to grace and life and to obedience before him. And the good part is, Romans states, we can trust him to judge these situations, and he is always paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important to point out too, that bitterness can fester in us from these situations. And, it can very much start where we were the victim and we were experiencing this hurt, and the anger and the pain and the sadness that we feel is very valid following that circumstance, but can very much it can become a temptation for bitterness, for sin. It's kind of a breeding ground for that. And I think even just reading or even talking with people who have deconstructed or left the church because of these situations, a lot of the times I feel like they start to equate their experience with a certain local church as how God views them. So if this pastor was, abusing authority, was, very legalistic or cruel towards them, that's how God is. Therefore, I don't want anything to do with God. So what would your suggestions be for someone who is going through this experience to be able to sort of separate their experience of a certain church and who God is and his character?
Well, yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges in this whole thing when you're dealing with hurt. And the first thing I would say is allow yourself time to deal with being hurt. You don't get over hurt overnight. Even if you decide you're going to walk the road of forgiveness, it is a road of forgiveness. And if you want to walk the road of healing, it is a road of healing, which means allow yourself to have the moments where you fall down and you're just mad, where you want to scream out at God, and understand he's big enough to take it. So, nothing you say is going to surprise him or hurt his feelings. He is the creator God, and he's far bigger than any of our words could cause difficulty. So,
and he already knows what we're feeling.
That's right. Exactly.
So it's okay if we express it.
Yes. In fact, you should probably just express it and get it out and start with it, because if you actually state it and it comes out of your mouth, oftentimes then you can actually evaluate what you're really feeling. When you don't state what you're feeling, when you don't express it, it is just there and it's larger than it really is, and you can't deal with it. So walk the road. Just accept that you're going to be able to walk the road. There are relationships in our life that God uses to give us pictures of who he is. And it is always difficult when sin twists those relationships, so it twists our perception of who he is. The child who had an abusive father, when they hear that God is my father, they're not comforted until they can understand that their experience of their father and that sinfulness that was there is not the experience of God. And that's a struggle to break apart. The wife that was abused by a husband, when she hears that Jesus is the husband of the church, that's not a comforting picture until you look at it and realize that everything that husband was not, Jesus is for the church. He's the one that we see in the Old Testament that was willing to go over and over and over again to the prostitute that was his wife to draw her back, even though she was full into adultery. And you look at the people of Israel, they were anything but a good example of a
faithful wife.
Faithful wife. And yet we see the picture of the faithfulness of God. So part of it is actually addressing the fact that those images are there and they're marred, and that it's okay to be triggered by that reality. If you had an abusive father and you're in church on a Father's Day and they do this big thing honoring fathers, boy, you got to take a breath and know that it's going to be there, and know that you need to look towards our Heavenly Father versus our father. Growing up, I love my dad to death, and my dad is a great man, and I have learned many things from him. But when I was young, my parents' divorce caused, breaking of some of those images of God for me as well, things I've had to wrestle with. And they're not really, other than the fact that my family was broken by adultery and divorce, that was my father's fault. The breaking of those images, I can look at and say they were impacted by the actions and the sins of my father, but they're not really his fault. But when, as a child, your father's no longer there, he's not there present because, your parents don't live together anymore. And your father loves you, but he's not there with you. All of a sudden wrestling with, how do I view God? Do I view God as, he loves me and he's out there, but he's not present and interactive and trying to help me in my life? That's a big challenge. That's one that I wrestled with a lot growing up, is, seeing and knowing that God loved me, but yet never really seeing that God wanted to be actually in my life, and he cared about my life and the little things of it. And so you have those pictures that you have to wrestle with. And part of it, I would say, is depending on how bad that image marring is, go get help. Because you're probably not going to recognize the depth of that hurt and the damaging of that image, much less be able to walk into a proper image alone. It's not a path to take alone. And that's why people tend to want to give up on things, because it's also a painful path, because you got to deal with the pain. Getting on the other side of it, though, is freedom. It is health. It is, walking through things. You will still have scars, so don't ever think that you walk through life without scars. But scars aren't bad. Open wounds are bad. Scars just mean that I've had experiences, and I've been able to see both what the hurt and impact of sin is, but the healing and help that God brings. It's when you're dealing with the open wounds, those will kill you.
And what advice would you have for someone who maybe went through some kind of very, not just church hurt, but something that was spiritually abusive, and something that, like you said, they're dealing with an open wound currently, because healing is a journey, and they might be at a point in their healing where it might be triggering to go to a church service or go to something. What kind of advice would you have for someone that's in that place, that still wants to take part in the body of Christ, but it is triggering for them for whatever reason? They might have gone through some really severe abuse.
Well, one, find people to walk through it with you. Walking through it alone is really hard. So find some people that are willing to walk that road with you. Realize that your value to God is in you, not in what you do. And so that it's okay to go and just sit in the back and be there, and realize that you don't have to be a part of anything, because when you're being triggered, you're not in a state where you can minister. So it is the time for you to be ministered to. And it's the time for you to find people that can come around you to help you. And so give yourself that time. Realize you don't have to earn God's favor. God's already died on the cross for you. There is absolutely nothing that you can do to be greater value to him. And God doesn't need you to do the work in the world. He invites you to join into the work. And part of that is even your own healing. So give yourself that space and do that. If the pain or the hurt is bad enough, then seek good professional help, because abuse and trauma are very real things, and PTSD reactions to things and triggering things is a very real reality. And getting help for that can be sometimes something you cannot do just alone. So it's hard to give a cut and dry, here, do this, because
here's your formula.
It depends on the trauma that you're going through. So, when when I went through that church experience where got corrected from the pulpit, it actually tore apart my family, not my immediate family of me and my wife, but my family and my greater family. So it put hurdles and obstacles and ripped apart me and my mother, and put difficulties in our relationship and you're pulling that away. And I walked out of that not knowing, you feeling so twisted around. Here I'm went to school for pastoral studies. I'm a big fan of theology and the Bible. And yet I didn't know which way was up when I walked out of that experience. I didn't know what was real about God and what wasn't, what was real about the church anymore or what wasn't. And I had difficulty. And there was a period of time, even for myself, where I sat out of church for 6 months because I realized I could not even sit in a church service and not be triggered.
Yeah.
And that was just the reality of where I was at. Now, I was also not alone. I had a friend that often would come over and we would talk. And I remember the day that it broke through, that I realized how bitter I actually was and how critical I was when we were talking about things. And we're sitting there and I'm talking about the church in such a negative voice while he's sitting in my office on the floor. And he's just talking about, yes, but, I just love this person. And I just love this person. And, this person just cares and God just loves that person. And look what God has done over here. And I'm just like going, I do not see the same thing he sees. And it was a breaking point for me that allowed me to realize that I need to see the church through God's eyes so that I can forgive the church for the hurt that I have. And that's a hard road. Forgiveness is, we throw it around where we say, I forgive you, hey, but forgiveness never happens without a cost. We're forgiven before God because Jesus died on the cross. That was a huge price he paid so that we could be forgiven. If I'm going to forgive somebody, it means I'm taking on a cost. And that cost might simply be, I am no longer choosing to over and over and over again replay the hurt that was there. I'm choosing when I wake up in the morning that I will look towards good versus bad, that I will do these things. It's not a dismissing of the hurt, because that's wrong. It's saying the hurt is real, but in spite of that, I will still choose to do right and I will still choose to love. And that's a daily choice you make. And it is one of those ones on the road that you hit, at first you're hitting, 2 out of 5, and then you're hoping to get 3 out of 5. And then you get to 5 out of 5 days. And then you're hoping, okay, now I can bridge to maybe 6 days. And then, okay, we can get 7 days in a row. And it is that path that you have to take, and you make those choices to kind of move forward. And so that's the challenge that's there. Community is the big thing in all of this. So find that community. If you need to step out of the church for a period of time, don't do it in isolation. Find people who are that you can share the hurt with, explain the hurt and experience, that people that will come around and pray with you, that will spend time with you and help you to, after a period of time, go back into the church.
I like how you emphasize how important community is, because I think right now across all denominations, we are seeing this huge movement of deconstruction, and a lot of people that ending in just totally leaving the church, because when they're hurt, instead of seeking that community, they just run and they cut themselves off. And nothing good happens in isolation. That's where, the devil works. That's where that bitterness and that shame will breed, is in that isolation. So it's so important to find that community, even if, especially if you're actively being triggered when you go to church or mass, or you might need to leave that church or just completely take a step back, but still having that community and having those people that can walk with you and still, help you, as you said, can be good images of God in that time when your church failed you.
Yep.
And speak truth into
Yeah.
you, because I think, like you were saying too, like a lot of times you can't recognize, like you might
Mhm.
recognize, like, okay, I am struggling with feeling like I know God exists, but he's absent.
Yeah.
I don't know where that comes from or why I'm feeling that way. And having someone who cares about you and who knows enough of what has gone on could
Mhm.
say, do you ever think it's because, your dad was absent for that period of your development?
Mm.
Oh, well, that would make a lot of sense. And now I can
Well,
actually
and
like address that and
yep, you
navigate
can
through
start
that.
kind of navigate
Yeah.
what that actually means. Yeah, it's always the challenge of looking for where your professed theology and your lived theology and the gap that's there.
Mm.
So I can say God loves me, but if I live my life like he's always in judgment of me, then I have a gap between what I know in my head and what I know in my heart. And what the goal always is to bridge that together so that what I know in my head is also what I realize in my heart, so that I don't have those gaps. But it's hard to see those gaps outside of community. I can say I love people, but if I never have to interact with anybody, then do I really know if I love people? Because,
It's also
if I'm
easier to
just
love people when
interacting
you're
with
not around
myself,
them.
I'm always right when I argue with myself. It's much different when I have to deal with somebody else and they, call me on the carpet, or they look at the words that I say or the actions that I live, and they go, you seem like you're not quite, going there. And those are oftentimes things I can't recognize myself. I need other people to interact with. And sometimes I just need to actually see it in somebody else, not necessarily even hear it. I need to see it. I need to live life with people. And that's so important.
Yeah. That's awesome. I think that's two really great resources that are very practical that someone could seek out too, is that sort of that peer-to-peer community, but then also professional, resources and that community with a professional environment, kind of attacking at both angles there, so you get the either a Christian counselor or even just a therapist being able to speak into, sort of the effects of that trauma, but then also just community and friendship and relationships of people who can keep you accountable and point out like maybe where they see bitterness beginning and address that so that you can actually heal instead of just continue down this road of pain.
Yep. Yeah. And the challenge is always to realize, first and foremost, we have an idea of what church should be. We see this idea of perfect people that perfectly love each other, that are the perfect supporting family. And we have this idea. And, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Life Together put it, it's that very expectation of what church is that often makes me the accuser of the brother. And we need to let go of that as well and realize that the church is made up of people like us, a lot of sinful people that are blundering their way through life, seeking after God, and we're all doing it together, which means, like it or not, we're going to hurt each other. And we got to be committed to the reality that we're going to walk that path together. Now, I always want to be careful saying that, because the caveat is there's a lot of hurts that happen just because we rub shoulders together and we're walking in community. Because as soon as we have more than one person, I mean, if you've ever been in a relationship or been married to anybody, that living with people will cause you to rub shoulders and do things, you'll irritate each other. No matter how much you love each other, you'll irritate each other. And the same is true about the church. We're going to walk down that road, and we just need to be committed to walk that road together, which means addressing things. We need to have a community that actually addresses problems and realities when they're there and they're small. Too often we hide those, and that's been the nature of the church. And I think that's why people are deconstructing more than anything else, is because we've carried this idea of, where we have to be holy, we have to be perfect. And what we end up being is just a bunch of hypocrites, because we are a bunch of hypocrites. I hate to say it, but, we all say we love each other and I really don't like them. We all wrestle with that reality because we are still, bridging that gap. We haven't yet walked into eternity where sin is removed from our life. And so we're still kind of, messing around with that. If we understand that, then it's easier to navigate the small hurts. Now, the abuse, that's not something you ignore. That abuse is not something you just walk in and say, I'm going to forgive because I just don't want people to meet my people might not meet my expectations.
Sure.
So I always want the caveat is, don't go, hey, everything's okay. Yeah, they're a little abusive, but that's okay. That's just who they are. No, it's never okay. It's never okay to be okay with sin. It's okay when the sin is the callousness of our selfishness as we blunder through together. Yeah, love covers a multitude of sins like that. We can forgive each other for that careless word or the careless moment or the time that, somebody wouldn't sit and listen when we needed to say something. Those are moments of living life together. We forgive those. But when somebody is abusive or harmful or they're causing pain and destruction, no, we need to stand against that. And we should never let that go as a church. And every time we've done that, we mar our witness. And, we send people out to go be deconstructed because we just weren't willing to be honest enough and say, yes, that happened. Yes, people were hurt. And yes, that was really wrong. And God did not honor that. And we need to just be, straight up with that. And sometimes that's done individually, as in I've walked through this pain knowing that, God looked at that and said, that hurt. And I understand that hurt. And that was wrong that you had to experience that. And knowing that he is willing to heal that. And he's not only willing to heal that, but he's willing to take that into eternity and make it better. I can hold on to that and I can do that. But if I ignore the sin, all I'm doing then is giving free rein for the next person to be hurt and abused.
Yeah.
And that's not right.
And I think a lot of times these issues are kind of held in the dark because I think sometimes people are nervous to address the fact that the church is imperfect because they feel like acknowledging imperfection ruins our witness. And in fact, they end up doing the opposite because covering that up or keeping things in the dark or not addressing sin when it needs to be addressed is what ruins our witness. And so really a huge solution for this is even just being willing to talk about it with each other and keep each other accountable and to bring up these situations honestly and acknowledge them and show that we're not afraid to face the messiness of, Christian community on this side of heaven. Because I think it is a healthy longing that we have, that we want the community that we one day will have in heaven, which is perfect.
Yeah.
And recognizing we don't have that now. And we should be able to talk about that.
We should be able to talk about that. And we need to just also realize that a church without conflict is probably the most spiritually abusive place you've ever been. Because people don't walk with freedom. People don't wrestle with doubts. People don't struggle with truth. People don't change in a vacuum of unmessiness. And so there needs to be the expectation of messiness, as in, I need to be willing to have people see the messiness that I struggle with. And I need to be willing to see the messiness that they struggle with and be able to see that that's God at work. But when you look around, everybody's perfect, and nobody fights, and there's no conflict, that's a bad situation. That's as bad as the outright war in the church. Because the outright war in the church is then we have a bunch of people that are grabbing at power and they've forgotten that unity is what Christ died for.
Yeah.
And so both of those extremes are very unhealthy, but that little part in the middle is still pretty messy. And you've got to be willing to let it be messy. And that's actually healthy.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to be so vulnerable and share your own experiences and your own hurts, but then also just your wisdom of kind of walking and being on the other side of that, I think is really helpful for someone who has either had that in their past or is going through it currently, to just kind of hear from the mouth of someone who's walked in those shoes, I think is really good.
Yeah, I
So,
think
yeah.
it's great to have a witness tell their story of someone that has gone through church hurt and even spiritual abuse within the church, but then someone that walked through that and went through the healing and is still in the body of Christ and is still in the church, is still a Christian and still loves Jesus and can differentiate between the broken and flawed humans that have hurt you and the actual character of God, because
Mhm.
so many people are leaving right now. And I just think it's good to have a witness of someone that stayed.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you.
And yeah, you should continue to talk about it.
Yes.